This
Be recorded.
conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so hi. It's good to see you all again. I'm glad to be back. I really enjoyed last week's lesson. I hope you all did too. I know I really got a lot from it, and something you'll find from or find out about me in this is that a lot of these questions that we're asking, I'm still asking myself, and I'm still trying to learn about them. So, just because I'm teaching the class doesn't mean I really know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of the times, it's sort of a personal journey for me, and a lot of these things are ways in which I can kind of think out loud in some cases and kind of bounce some ideas off of real live people and see how they work and how they hold up to scrutiny. So, that being said, comments and questions and objections and all that sort of thing are very welcome and very much appreciated. So I really enjoyed the amount of discussion and participation that we had last time. So thank you for that. Now, a few of you mentioned, or at least one of you mentioned, that you listened to a class, the first class that I did, Raymond Kisby, and that class was called An Introduction to Christian Philosophy. And what we basically studied in that class were you remember we talked about last week the kind of three pillars of philosophy, the true, the good, and the beautiful, and how everything really that enters into human endeavor will fall under one of those three things. Or perhaps anything bad you do will have a lacking in one of those three things. And when Jesus comes to earth, in John 14:6, he says he's actually the fulfillment of all of those things. He is the way, the truth, and the life. So no one actually comes to the Father, to the highest source of authority and the highest source of meaning, except through Christ. Christ is the unity and fulfillment of those three things. So in the last class that I taught, the first class I taught with this, kind of focused on that first one, on the true. It was really kind of an introduction to Christian philosophy as such. It was the basis for what it takes to reason philosophically, especially as a Christian, especially in today's world. So we kind of talked about a lot of, it really falls into epistemology. That's really what it would be called, which is the theory of knowledge. How do you know what you know? And how do you go about knowing things? How do you go about acquiring knowledge? So from that, you get into, say, logical principles. And that's an important starting point, That's an important basis for anything else you'll try to study throughout your life. Is, a foundation for how you reason in the first place. So that's kind of what it was. So I see this class particularly as kind of being a continuation of that. And this is why I actually requested to teach this ethics class, because it's kind of the next step. We studied the true in that class. Now we're studying the way. We're studying ethics. We're studying how you apply these truths that we've learned about God to your life in a practical way. So there's sort of a natural progression here. And by the way, if that's the case, I'll obviously talk to Quentin about this more to see if we can do another class eventually. Of course, it'll have to be online since I'm moving. But I can do another class eventually, which kind of carries the progression forward, and do a study of the beautiful, of the life part of it, of what Jesus says he is the fulfillment of. So that would be sort of a class on aesthetics from a Christian perspective. Now, that may not appeal to some people from the title alone, but I think it would be a really helpful and interesting topic, especially to study from a Christian perspective. So that was just an idea. There's sort of a natural progression to this. Now, to get into what we're talking about today, tonight I'm going to be mentioning a few books that I've read that have to do with the topic of ethics. And so, if you're looking for personal reading and further research, which I hope you are, I mean, that's kind of the point, is to introduce you to the topic if you haven't known much about it before, and see if you can kind of get into it on your own, or if you already have thought much about it, just to kind of further inform what you do know. But I mentioned, I think, or I don't know if I mentioned this or not. We did mention this idea, which was that morality is sort of a human universal, right? But most of the things that we understand to be right and wrong have been universally understood as such from the beginning of time. Now, C.S. Lewis, in his book called The Abolition of Man, really lays that out very well. And there's an appendix to this book, which is he calls it Illustrations of the Tao. And he uses the term Tao, spelled T-A-O, kind of loosely in a sense. It's, I believe we mentioned that word too. Basically, there's a ancient Chinese religion called Taoism, and they follow the Tao. And the Tao basically could be translated as the way. And so you can kind of equate that with what Jesus is saying when he says, I am the way. Sort of the path through that your life must take is the objective standard of truth and the objective standard of moral truth. So that's what Jesus is. And so that, when C.S. Lewis talks about the Tao, that's really what he's talking about. Now he goes through it, and it's interesting in this book, he goes through and shows kind of general moral laws, and he illustrates, he shows references from different major cultures throughout history and how they all had the same basic idea. So, yeah, go ahead. The title is The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. And you guys can look at this during a break or whenever if you want to. I can't loan it to you because I'm moving soon. People don't usually return books that fast, at least in my experience. The first one he talks about is the law of general beneficence. Just generally speaking, being beneficent would be, essentially being kind towards others and not trying to harm them. And so he kind of goes through, he has Egyptian sources, of course, the Jewish sources in the Old Testament, the Christian ones, Old Norse, Babylonian. I mean, it's really it's not comprehensive, it's not exhaustive, in other words, but it is a really good basis for seeing in different cultures. Okay, yeah, all the major cultures from antiquity seem to have the same basic ideas of what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And that's a really important point to start with, especially if you're, say, talking about ethics to someone who doesn't have the Christian worldview, and especially to someone who doesn't even believe in God. C.S. Lewis himself in his book, Mere Christianity, really uses the moral argument for the existence of God quite a lot, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. It's the idea that since we all do have this universal understanding, basically speaking, of what's right and wrong, we all kind of do believe in God, essentially. That's a really good evidence for God being there, because if we believe in a standard, the standard has to exist somewhere. And so that's a basic argument for the existence of God. But that's a really good book to kind of get you started in understanding ethics. Now, it's not really a book about ethics per se. It's really about how the universal moral law is being abandoned by people in the postmodern age. That's kind of what he's talking about. And back then, that's when all this stuff is kind of happening, and written, basically in the early 60s. It's interesting, Quentin made a point to me, I think, which is that we're really actually today living in the postmodern age. That kind of doubting of all standards is somewhat over to a degree. A lot of people are already starting to go back and say, you know what, there are some standards for some things. We've seen that now. Not everything is just relative. But the problem we're finding now is, okay, well, what is the standard and what is absolute in the world? And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out here regarding ethics, is what is absolute, what can we say with integrity is true regarding what we should do with our lives, especially on a practical level. So do you remember what the specific situation was that I talked about last week? Some of you weren't here, of course, because some of you leave after the first hour, which is fine, and so we'll kind of reintroduce it. But tonight, basically, what we're talking about is telling the truth, kind of the dichotomy between truth and lie, and in essence, living honestly in the world. Now, can any of you that were here during that second period tell me what's the situation that we talked about? Yes.
The man that was coming into the house and the daughters were upstairs.
Okay, right, yes. Now, so you basically have a serial killer / rapist that comes in, and he's a known guy. I guess he's on the run. It's a pretty common story. You probably heard the situation before, the hypothetical situation. I don't know if it's ever actually happened. But this guy comes in, which is an important point, and I'll say something about that in a second. This guy comes in, and you say have daughters upstairs, and he's got you at gunpoint, let's say, and he asks, is there anyone else in the house? Now, and this is what I want to say. It is a hypothetical, and the problem with a lot of those is some people will try to use hypothetical situations to make false dilemmas. A false dilemma is basically when you say you've got one of two options, and that's all. And when you think about it, you think, you know what? There are a lot of other options I could think of that I could do. And I think that's the case in this. I've heard this particular scenario introduced as a dilemma, and it really isn't so. It's not like you have to say yes or no. I mean, I probably would be thinking more about trying to get the gun away from the guy, or maybe not say anything at all, So the real question is, if you said no, there's no one in the house. If you lied, would that be a sin? What do you think?
No.
Okay. And then, of course, you have to follow up with a why.
I don't think you're obligated to go along with the legal system. I don't think you're obligated to give it more power.
Evil system, could you define that more for me?
Well, you have someone that if they get their way, they're not trustworthy and they're going to random evil. So you're not obligated to give them more power.
Okay.
It's like the midwives and Moses.
Oh, you're jumping ahead of me now.
But God blessed them.
That's true. That's true. Is there any dissent? Not to cause problems, but it's always more interesting. Go ahead.
Well, and just because you might be operating on a moral ground doesn't mean that that person will respond in the same way. You can expect, in the same vein that Abby was talking about, you can expect that person to then respect those same moral, probably ground that you are operating from. And so I agree with her in the sense that I don't think you're obligated
Okay. In a sense,
to obey or to keep those same ground because there is consequences. And there's no standard that person abides by.
I see. So in a sense that you're going down the way, but that person's not in the way, right? He's not on the same path you are. So it's like you can't really interact with him the same way you would with someone that's on the way. Is that essentially what you're saying? I don't want to misquote you.
No, because you can pull out a different situation, like say, I am the only Christian in my family. And so lying to them isn't necessarily the same as lying to this hypothetical rapist. I don't see them as the same situation.
Right. Okay. Okay. I see. So the situation would determine that then, essentially. And the person, I guess, the character of the person.
Right, the character of the person.
And you mentioned the consequence of the action too, right?
Right.
Well, I guess we can go over a couple of different instances, Well, no, I won't jump ahead of myself. I'll try to stick to a structure this time. But okay, I heard I'll leave that comment as it is, and you had your hand up and then jump. Okay.
You would, as a Christian, be obligated to tell if you choose to answer, because you have the choice not to answer. But as a Christian, your answer needs to be truthful. If I lie to this person, does it stop him from searching the house?
No, theoretically, no.
All right, so what have I gained at that point? I've gained nothing. Right, and again, this is this whole working within the limitations of the question that's presented initially. Okay. If I feel that in certain situations I can do something, we no longer have ethics, we have situational ethics, which are not ethics.
Can you define situational ethics in this context?
Situational ethics is where I can change my choice of what I do or say or act based on the moment or the environment that I'm in. And that, again, when it comes to truth, that cannot be. Right? Because God doesn't change what he says is right and wrong, depending on the situations that we as humans find ourselves in. And then we have the fact that just because somebody, and Allison was getting to this point, who I'm dealing with should not change who I am. Right now, you have different roles depending on a relationship. I'm a son, I'm also a parent. So within those roles, I have different responsibilities, but that doesn't change the way I act. I mean, as far as maybe my level of authority or my responsibility, but it should not change who I am. And as Christ was truthful in all things, we need to be truthful in all things if we are to be Christ-like. And that's pretty black and white, and I understand that. And I'm not saying that we are always successful, but if we're dealing with the hypothetical, surely we should be able to be successful. Let's take what it is going to be.
Right. Okay. So to sum it up, I guess you would say that if you said no to the answer, which isn't true.
Well, I'm not saying I would still say no.
Okay. Well,
I'm not saying that.
The question isn't so much what would you actually do, because I mean, who knows what I would actually do. The question is, would it be a sin to say no?
It would be a sin if you gave them this truth.
Gotcha.
Right? So
Oh,
my
wait,
answer
say that
no.
again?
It's a sin to give them this truth.
Oh, mistruth. I see.
Right? Okay? Don't answer. Right? I mean, lying changed the outcome. I mean, again, yeah, that's another person can bring up. We also get to that then that do the ends justify the means, or do the means justify the ends? And I think as Christians, the end is what justifies the means. The fact that we are to go to heaven, we are to live our soul, that justifies us maybe not going with the world on everything, but going with God on everything.
Okay. Now,
Because of the end in mind.
okay.
I mean, that's not a comfortable situation. That's not going to make you popular. But then again, Noah was not too popular.
I'm not either, but it's for different reasons. Okay, now what did you have to say?
So I would agree with Glenn, in that I think that, yes, it would be a sin, because all lying is sin, no matter what the situation is.
Okay.
Okay, and the other 2 points that I want to make, though, is that God will never allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able to bear. So He'll never put you in a situation in which you are having to make a choice in which you cannot, where you have so much difficulty, you cannot make the right choice. And He also is going to take care of you to the degree where He's looking out for us. So this discussion about whether or not this is a sin, it's almost like a trap. You're trying to, and this is the kind of things that the atheists and others try to present Christians with, these moral dilemma traps, in order to get them to make a choice in which it violates the principles by which they claim to live as Christians. So, you're tempted to lie because you don't want anybody in your house to be harmed. Why? You don't owe this guy anything, and he's going to harm your family. So then why wouldn't you lie? So I think that these scenarios are dangerous for people to talk about. And I think that if you start waffling on whether or not lying is situational, all of Christianity falls apart when you start talking about situational ethics. Because ethics are not situational. God's principles are not situational.
Now, would you accept his definition of situation, or are you using it?
I'm using a different one.
Okay, what would you do?
My situational ethics are, depending on the situation, the principles of the situation define how you react, or they influence how you react. And it's not necessarily what you end up doing that is the right or the wrong. It's the how you get there. So in certain situations you might do something different than you would in other situations. There's no universal guiding principle. You in this situation I would do this because this is a better outcome than I would do in this other
So it's kind
situation.
of consequences oriented.
Right. Exactly. And so the other thing, one more thing I would want to mention is that there were Christians in the first century that were faced with a very significant dilemma where they were told to deny Christ and either live or die. And so in those situations, what you could also craft another scenario where you have a Christian in the first century or even today who's told, if you deny Christ, then I will spare you and your family. If you continue to say that Christ is Lord and that God created the world and continue to affirm your Christian belief, then you and your family will die. So the answer is, what is the right thing to do? Do you deny Christ and try to save your family? And so I would say in that situation, if you're looking at it from a spiritual standpoint, it would be awful for you and your children to die. But you're going to be in heaven. So ultimately, your eternal spiritual, if you're spiritually focused, you realize that the here and now is not as important as the eternal. And so it's not worth denying Christ, because He says, if you deny me, I will deny you. So
now, isn't this is to kind of follow up? Is that not sort of still is that still not kind of consequence oriented as well? Eternal consequence, of course, but isn't it more even that still focused on on the end result rather than what's simply right in itself? What would you say to that?
Well, no, because it's right in itself never to deny Christ.
Okay.
Regardless of the outcome. That's what I'm saying, is that you hold to your principles regardless of the outcome. So the outcome of death for you and your family is not worth the sin of denying Christ. And so what I'm saying is you hold to the principles regardless of the outcome. So situational ethics to me would be somebody in that situation would say, I'm going to deny Christ in order to spare my family, but I'm going to continue being a Christian. That's situational ethics, the way I look at it. My view would be it's not ever worth denying Christ at any point, regardless of whether or not it is based, whether or not it would save your life.
Okay. Now, okay, so we have, I'm trying to make as little actual, like, opinionated comment on these opinions as I can at first. I'm kind of trying to feel the waters out. So now we'll kind of transition and move over to the question.
Okay, and I think it's Luke, when Jesus told his brothers and they wanted him to go, and they wanted him to show all the things he could do, they were not believers, and yet Jesus said he wasn't gonna go, but Jesus did go.
Okay, well, I think I ought to make a sort of point of order there. That's John chapter 7. Now,
Right, John, thank you.
Now, well, the real point of order wasn't that. It was that Jesus said he wasn't going to go at that time. And he didn't. He went later. So I don't know if that particular instance could be used, as an example of
But he
Jesus
did,
lying.
he did not want to, they assumed he was not going to go.
Right, that's
Because he
probably
told
true.
them.
That's probably.
He said
I guess I wouldn't know, but
he wasn't
okay.
gonna go, and then he decided to leave, or went at a later time. So he picked the opportune time, did not want to, evidently go with them. But to me, when he says, no, I'm not going, and then goes, to me, it's like he changed his mind. Like, say, for example, we used to have Bible studies on Friday night, and we were told we had the same thing. If somebody came in with a gun and said, is there any more Christians in the house? Would you, yeah, I'll show you the room where they're at. I mean, I don't know about that.
Right. Okay.
I mean,
All right,
I
fair
think the
enough.
situations depends upon, it depends upon, I'm not saying Jesus lied, but he told him he wasn't going, and he did go.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, I'll leave that at that. And I appreciate all the comments. And it's good. There are some disagreements. And before we get into, I guess, the underlying issues, which is what I'll try to stick to more than the issue itself. I'd like to, as much as possible, try to let you draw your own conclusions, right? And kind of reason for yourself. Now, that doesn't mean my opinions won't come into it, because they obviously will. It's kind of hard to keep mine out, and I don't really have a desire to. But what we'll start at is kind of, do you remember, I'll kind of remind you of this, the kind of, I guess you might say, the hermeneutic, the method by which we're kind of, at least the way I go about trying to figure out what is right and what's wrong, what you would do, especially in specific situations or regarding specific things, is there are two sets of principles I outlined just last week briefly near the end. Now, and the first set is really, the first thing you do is you ask, like, why is an action good in the first place? We're talking about telling the truth. And so the underlying issue there would be, and we're kind of starting at the beginning. Now, we'll get back to the specific issue, but we have to kind of start at the generalities first and kind of look at the underlying issues. What's so important about telling the truth in the first place, right? And so what I initially do is I think, well, what I'm trying to do in being good is really to be like God, right? I'm trying to take the characteristics of God and make them true in my life. So I'm trying to imitate, well, basically that's what we mean when we say we imitate Christ, right? So we can look and we see that, well, a characteristic of God is being not just truthful and faithful, but he's also truth itself, right? He's the standard of truth. John chapter 1 and verse 1 says that God is the Word, and in John 17:17 says that the Word is truth. So kind of do the math there, and you've got God being really equated with, or maybe not equated with, but I guess one leading to the other, God being truth. So so you kind of have this first standpoint, which is the divine characteristic. And so from a divine characteristic, in this case, truth, you can extrapolate a universal principle, which would apply to all mankind, right? It would apply generally. It would apply across the world to everybody. Now, not specific situations, because general principles, they don't apply to specific situations. The next step you do is you apply the general principle to your specific situation. And that's, I would say, distinct from situational ethics, just because I'm using the word situation, it doesn't mean I'm equating it to that. But, that's the basic thing you go through, right? And I think it's a pretty firm theological basis for right and wrong actions and for ethics, is you take a divine characteristic and you extrapolate a universal principle, and then you extrapolate that further and apply it into a specific application to your specific situation. Now, the divine characteristic in this case is, well, God is truth, right? He's truthful, he's faithful. So, and it's interesting too, there's a sort of dichromatic significance in the scriptures regarding that, because you have God who's represented as the standard of truth, especially in the person of Jesus Christ. That's the manifestation of it. But then you also have Satan kind of on the other hand, being the kind of the personification of lies, right? So for instance, in John chapter 8, verse 42 and 45, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and he's saying, your father is the devil, is Satan, because he's the father of lies. And so you're following along lies. So you're kind of going a part of your father, who's the devil. It says that when he lies, he speaks out of his own character. He's a liar and the father of lies. Because I, Jesus, tell you the truth, you don't believe me. So you kind of have Jesus and Satan opposed to each other in this sense. And it's the same in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 3, we see that God created the worlds through his word, right? That's what John 1:1 says, the word created the world. And you see in Genesis that God said, let there be light. So it's word which is creating the world. And then in chapter 2, verse 17, God tells Adam and Eve, he says, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you will surely die. Now that's God's word, that's his commandment. But then Satan comes in Genesis 3:4, and the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. So you kind of have opposed to each other the word of God, which is truth, as opposed to the word of Satan, you might say, in this case, which is a lie. Now, so we understand the divine characteristic is that of being truthful. And so our goal in this life obviously isn't to be like Satan, it's to be like God. And so we try to make truth a part of our lives. Now, so from that, you have you might say the universal principle, which is tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Now that is Laura, tell them where I got that from. Okay, and his book is, right. Now I really like the way he phrased that. I just wanted to, give that reference. I don't want to plagiarize, The reason I like that phrasing is because, like he says, telling the truth, or at least don't lie. We don't always know what the truth is, right? And so, I mean, that's the case. Depending on what situation you're in, you don't always know what the truth is. And so in your life, at least try not to say things which are lies. So that's kind of an important caveat to us. I mean, God can always tell the truth in every way, and he never lies. As a matter of fact, it's impossible for him to lie, James says. And so, but for us, we don't always know the truth. We don't always perceive things perfectly. So at least we try, as far as is in us lies, not to lie. Now, there are different applications to this. Now, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty, the specific applications. Now, I thought of 3 different situations. Now, tell me about these. Well, I'll lay them out first. And they kind of demand different applications of this principle, and you'll see that. The first one, let's say you come home, you're a man, and you come home and your wife asks you, where have you been? Okay, now you're supposed to tell the truth, right? Especially if you want a good, healthy, trusting relationship, you tell your wife where you've been. And then there's another situation, though. Let's say you're, like me right now, I'm a teacher in a class, and I'm supposed to tell you the truth, right? Or at least not to lie. I'm trying to give you truth. That's my goal here. That's what I'm supposed to do. And of course, as I guess participants in this class, you have the same responsibility to me, even though the responsibility is a little bit different. It's a different type of relationship. And then, of course, there's a third situation. Let's say you're a witness in a witness stand in a trial, and you are told to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but it, right? Now, you're, of course, required to do that. Now, these situations demand different things, right? Telling the truth is kind of different in each of these situations. So, for instance, when your wife tells you that, or asks you where you've been, I mean, obviously, you've got to be as open and honest as you can, because your goal there isn't just to, make sure you're not lying. The goal really is twofold. It's to make sure you're not lying, because God is true, but you're also trying to foster a good relationship with your wife. So you're trying to be open and honest. Women like that. Men like it too. We don't say it. So the thing is, you don't really have to give every detail, though, right? Let's say you go, I went to dinner with my friends, right? What'd you have to eat? Okay. Now, you have to tell them that you had, the French fries with, it doesn't really, I guess the point is what constitutes the truth in that particular case. There are some things which are essential, right, to the information, and there are other things which kind of lie on the boundaries that, aren't, I guess, the point of the question being asked. Now, in a teacher's position, that's a little bit different, right? I'm required to give you a little bit more in one way, right? I'm trying to give you something that's pretty thorough, especially regarding, in this case, the study of ethics. Yet I'm not supposed to give you every single thing, right? Me telling the truth to you doesn't mean talking about, my relationship with my wife or what me and my kids, did for fun yesterday or anything like that. I mean, that has nothing to do with the reason why we're here. in essence, you kind of collectively, at least, asked the question of me. What can you teach me about ethics? What can you lead us through and guide us through regarding the study of ethics? So, I'm sort of limited in that sense to telling the truth. Now, of course, in this case, it's interesting that a lot of these situations aren't necessarily moral or immoral, right? Not every decision you'll make and not everything you do has moral quality to it, at least in my opinion. Because, me going off on a tangent without thinking about it and talking about, say, my daughter, that's not like a sin, It just isn't particularly what we're here for. So anyway, not all these things are as important as others. That's important to note. Now, however, you're a witness stand in a trial. More is required of you there, right? You are required to tell not just the truth, but the whole truth. And the reason that point is put in there is because there's really nothing which would automatically say I can't withhold some information if I want to. Like in the situation we talked about, we always said, well, you could just refuse to answer, which is really accomplishing the same thing, or at least the attempt would be to accomplish the same thing you'd accomplish by lying, in a sense, which is you don't want them to know, right? Or at least you don't want them to know from you. You don't want to be responsible for that knowledge. I mean, that's what the desire, at least, that we have. So, in a witness's case, you're required to, if, let's say you witnessed a murder, you witnessed some other crime, you're really required to, ethically speaking, tell them everything that you saw and try not to leave anything out that would be important evidence for the jury to mull over. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So from the standpoint of telling everything you know, I think that you can withhold information. I disagree to a certain extent from the standpoint of like withholding information is not the same as lying.
Right.
Unless you are intending to deceive.
Right.
So if your intent is to deceive, like Ananias and Sapphira, now, did they get that much money from the land? Yes. But that is not all the money they got from land. And so did they get that much money for the land? And the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. But was it all the money? And were they intending to deceive the church and the apostles by representing that as all the money that they got from the land? And yes, they intended to misrepresent.
Right. So you could say their sin follows under the category of lie, loosely speaking, right? Because it served the same function as.
Technically, they did get that much money for the land, but their intent was to make it seem like they had done something different. Right.
So they kind of, on a larger scale, told a lie. Not saying speaking it, but through what they didn't say, they did
sort of withhold information with the intent to deceive.
Exactly.
And that's different than withholding information.
Right. Now, and that's important. That's a good segue into the next section. I did a word study, and the King James calls it guile, right? Deceitful guile. Most of the modern translations will call it deceit. And there are the verses that talk about it really kind of inform us on what the Bible is talking about when it talks about this particular concept. The first one is in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 14. And this is in the Old Law. It says, if a man will the idea. It's kind of being sneaky, crafty. The god Loki, right? He's the god of mischief. Or if you've ever seen the Avengers movies, you can kind of know what you're talking about because you think he's there, right? And you go and attack him, but he's actually an apparition and he's behind you the whole time. So that's that idea of you're trying to mislead people and make them think that something you're telling them is true, which actually isn't. So and that's really the standard of conduct, but in a lot of different, say, moral and ethical systems of throughout history. So, for instance, I initially thought of, say King Arthur and his knights, when they would fight someone, when a knight would go up to another knight to fight someone, you don't go up and stab him in the back. That was considered, completely dishonorable. What you do is you actually address him, even if you're in a big battle. If you read the text, even if you're in a big battle, what they did, at least in the stories, was they called the person by name and they lift their visor up so you can see who it is. Which, by the way, is where the salute comes from, if you didn't know that, lifting up the visor. Interesting fact, side note. And so they would do that, and they would actually fight one-on-one there, kind of challenge each other and go head straight on. That's why they had that stupid idea of riding two horses smack into each other. It's a terrible idea, but it was what honor demanded. And that culture really went down even to, where I'm from in the South. Southern gentlemen and their duels. That was kind of the same type of concept, is that if you're going to do something, if you're going to have a conflict, even if it's, a conflict, which nobody thought was a good thing to have or a moral thing to have, but you still have that code of conduct where you don't kill through guile or deceit. So, that's the first instance of that. And that's kind of a good illustration of what we're talking about, right? It's that deceptive quality which exists in you. And that's the thing, it's a state of character. And Psalm chapter 32 and verse 2 says, "Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit." And that's really the verse that Jesus is applying when he sees Nathanael coming in John chapter 1 and verse 47. He says, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." That's really what he's talking about. So it can be a state of character, but it's manifested in different ways, right? It's manifested, as Josh was saying, through your words, oftentimes. So Psalm 34:13 says, "Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit." And it's not always a lie. So Paul makes that point pretty clear too. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3, he's talking to the Thessalonians about him and the other apostles. And he says, "Our appeal to you does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive." That's the same word. So what Paul is essentially saying is him in preaching the gospel to them, he wasn't actually trying to fool them into, say, giving him money or respecting him or giving him any of the accolades that maybe they thought he deserved for it. So what if that were true, what he would be actually doing is telling the truth and preaching the gospel, but doing it for a deceptive motive. So, that's exactly what you're saying is you can even say things which are technically true or they correspond to that specific reality in that case. But overall, what you're trying to do is deceive. So we're told by Peter, 1 Peter 2, 1 through, starting in verse 1, he says, "Put away all those, put away malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander." And the reason is because this is what Christ was. This is how he acted. Verse 21 and 22, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth." So Christians are called to lay aside all deceit and guile, because that is a characteristic of God. He's truth. He's truthful, and that was manifested in the person of Jesus Christ. So we have that hermeneutic, you might say, represented to us there just in that text. You have a divine characteristic, and it's manifested in Jesus, and so it becomes this universal principle which is applied to our specific situations. And so you have it fulfilled, really, in the book of Revelation, chapter 14 and verse 5, Jesus and the Holy Spirit existing in the New Jerusalem, in his people. And it says that in their mouth was no lie found, for they are blameless. So we kind of take on that quality of God into ourselves. But also, last of all, the verse I found was 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. There's a very pragmatic aspect to this as well, as far as earthly consequences go. It says, for whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. And that's the thing, there's a very pragmatic element to avoiding this vice of lying and being deceitful, because really, it doesn't work out for you in the long run at all. And anyone, even a non-Christian, can tell you that. So, that's basically the idea here, that you're supposed to be a truthful person. And whether it's a lie you're speaking, which is, a technical lie, as in it actually doesn't correspond to reality in that case, or whether you're telling the truth, even the truth in a sense, to mislead, it still falls under the category of being deceitful. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I think it's also important to recognize you don't have to answer a question with because you understand when somebody's asking you a question, you usually understand what answer they want. But you don't always have to give them the answer that they're asking for, unless they're an authority that demands that sort of answer. So if you're in a court of law, they ask you a specific question, you have to give the truth. But look at the examples of what Jesus did when the Sadducees and Pharisees were trying to trap him. So there were multiple times where they tried to trap him. They were hoping he would give a certain answer that would cause him to look bad or trap him in some way. And he did not answer them. You can answer wisely without lying, without giving the answer that they are specifically asking for when somebody doesn't have the authority necessarily to demand that answer from them.
Right. Well, James wouldn't smile at me earlier, and I was saying he's not really, I have no entitlement to a smile from him. And, that's the thing is, a lot of these things depend on our relationships to each other and where we fall in those relationships, because Jesus had no reason to give them the answers that they wanted just because they asked for it. Now, there's a different case depending on the relationship, though, right? So, for instance, when he is tried in a public court, of course, he's not required to say anything there either. And of course, we have the same thing. You can actually be silent, and that's something that's granted to us. But he made it very clear that everything he did and everything he taught was open, was honest, and that all of the governing officials that were trying him could have seen everything that he had done. He never tried to hide anything from them. So that's an important point. There was no deceit or guile found in Jesus. And that's the thing, is he had that responsibility to the governing authorities to be open and honest, right? I mean, they did have authority over him, and he recognized that. Of course, he recognized that that authority ultimately came from him, being God. But basically what he's saying is he never tried to deceive them. And Paul did the same thing. When he was tried, he's like, I was teaching openly, and that's an important point. The apostles, when they were beaten for preaching the gospel and told not to do it anymore, they obviously said we have to obey God rather than men. But they always accepted the punishment for what they did. And I think that's a good underlying, I guess, rationale for even civil disobedience, which I know kind of is side. Your relationships with people will kind of determine what you owe them as far as truth goes. Now, all of this stuff too kind of focuses me. I'll kind of shift the focus a little bit here. Now, of course, we're kind of going through the underlying issues to all these things, but we'll get back to the specific situation in a little while. We've talked about an extreme. Well, we've talked about guile and deceit, and what that really is an extreme away from truth, right? It's not so much that a lie is something like an entity in itself. You've probably heard the phrase that in every truth or in every lie there's some element of truth, right? And that's definitely the case. It's not like you completely invented a new reality in order to tell that lie. You've just kind of pieced together things which do exist in this world into an order in which they don't actually go. As far as I can tell, that's really what a lie is. And so you're really kind of going towards an extreme. And this made me think of Aristotle's idea of the golden mean. And the golden mean is basically, he says, if you're trying to find a virtue always lies between two vices, two extremes, two, say, departures from the Tao. So, for instance, I don't know if we mentioned it or not. If you're trying to find the virtue of courage, you have two extremes on either end of that, right? So you could be someone that's a coward, right? You have something that you ought to do, and yet you're afraid to do it, and so you let that fear control you to the point where you actually don't do what's good. And we know, of course, that if you know to do something which is good and you don't do it, that's a sin. So that cowardice can cause you to sin. That's one extreme. But the other thing is, you can kind of go too far the other way and be a complete fool, right? And kind of be, I guess, foolhardy is the way Aristotle would put it, and go ahead and cause a lot of damage because you weren't afraid at all. So, two extremes to this, and the golden mean between these two extremes is where the virtue lies, where courage is. Where you understand the situation, you understand what you ought to do, but you also take your fear into account, but you still go ahead and do the right action regardless of the fear. And so I think that's the important principle. And so this would apply, well, let's do an experiment really. If that applies in those cases, what about the case with truth? If we're saying that every virtue, now this is a question, really an open question, and I'll have Quentin say something, and you're saying 5 minutes? Okay. Then we won't have Quentin say something. Let's see. If every virtue is the golden mean between two vices, then what's the other vice for the virtue of truth? We talked about one extreme, right, which is being deceitful and being someone that's filled with lies, trying to fool. Now, what is there another extreme? Is there another way in which you could misuse this idea of truth and go towards the other extreme? Now, before I really ask for some more comments on that, I want to go into something which was mentioned by one of you at the very beginning. I think Abigail mentioned it, which is, and this might really throw a wrench into the whole discussion we've been having so far. I've tried to keep away comment from the different views, but I just want to throw this out there and see what happens, I guess. So what if I were to tell you that there were 3 occasions at least in which God supported deceit? Now, before I say anything else, that's a possibility, okay? And I'll read the 3. There are 3 instances in the Old Testament that I can think of. Now, you might question the interpretation of some of them, saying, well, that's not really what God was doing. I actually think, this is where I will give my opinion, I think it's really hard hermeneutically to actually do that. So I'll give you the situations. The first one, I'll read them. The first one is in Exodus chapter 1, the one Abigail mentioned, verses 15 through 20. Exodus 1, 15 through 20. And really, I guess if we're going to get into this and we have to do our Devo and the Lord's Supper in just a few minutes, maybe we ought to save this until later. Come to think of it, because this will kind of be a lot. So maybe we should stop now and kind of continue after that. So for those of you that won't be here for the latter half of that, I guess you get to think about that on your own. So, and thank you guys for being here.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so we were going to go through these instances and at least possible instances of when God supported deceit. And this is in Exodus. The first one's going to be in Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. So turn there if you have a Bible. So I'll just kind of lay these out, then we'll talk about them, okay? Exodus 1, 15 through 20. Well, I might give some comments in between, but you can't. Okay, so, well, you can, but I don't want to be a tyrant. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, which is a funny name. When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. Okay, now before I go on to the next one, I was just thinking that some common objections to this. One of the, let's see, Quentin and I at the Freed, right?
They argued that this was a true statement, that they did give birth so vigorously that they weren't able to get there.
Yeah, no, at the very least, that is highly unlikely, in my opinion. Now, you have a professional opinion, I'm sure.
Well,
What's
the
that?
two OBs just left. No comment.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's what I was going to say, really. It's pretty unlikely that that's a true statement.
Very difficult. Now, I will say the one argument that he did bring up, and this is a possibility, is that they purposely delayed. That doesn't change, though, the statement that they made to Pharaoh.
Right. Now, if they purposefully delayed, which is possible.
That's possible.
They still pretty much lied.
Might have been truthful.
Well,
by saying that they were already born when they got there. But the reasoning behind it,
right,
at least would have misrepresented the truth.
Right. I mean, they're not. It's not because the Jewish women were more vigorous. It's because we waited a while, basically. So it'd still be a lie, really. Now the real question then, that's my thing, is that you really can't interpret this as anything except that wasn't true. They were trying to deceive Pharaoh, and they actually gave him some false information. Any way you look at it. Except, of course, if she were actually saying it was true and they really did give birth before midwife came, which my wife almost did last time we had the baby. But that's highly unlikely. So the question is, okay, does it say God dealing well with the midwives because she's lying, or is it because, they didn't kill the babies? Well, all I'll say before we get into it some more, and I read the next one first, is that the antecedent to that phrase, so God dealt well with the midwives, was that quote of them lying. It says it this way. This is just how it reads. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women because they're vigorous and they give birth before the midwives come to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, right? So the antecedent to him dealing well with them, the thing that comes before it was that lie. So you really can't, it's really hard to interpret this as saying God didn't deal well with them because of their actions, including the lie. Now, here's the next one. 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 18 through 23. I can't remember how I found this one. I don't know why. I wasn't looking for it, I don't think, or maybe I was. 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 18 through 23. Now, this is having to do with Elisha. You'll probably recognize this story. This is when Elisha tells God, open his eyes, his assistant's eyes, so that he can see the people that are, he says there are more with us than are with them. There's that sort of thing. So this is what was happening. 2 Kings 6, 18 through 23. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, please strike this people with blindness. So they struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, this is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. Now, first of all, that's him. They're looking for him. And they knew he was there, and there he was, and they were going to get him. And he says, this isn't the place. This isn't what you're looking for. I'll take you to the guy you're looking for. And he leads them to Samaria. As soon as they entered Samaria, Elisha said, O Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. So the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. Now, as soon as the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, my father, shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down? He answered, you shall not strike them down. Would you strike down those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow? set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master. So he prepared for them a great feast, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel. So that's an important point, how the consequence of this action ended up being good on a large scale. But the real point here is that God assisted Elisha in a deception. Now, this deception was obviously for a good cause. I mean, he was obviously had a good consequence. But the fact is, that was the city they were looking for. This was the place. Elisha was there. That's really who they were looking for. And when Elisha asked God to strike them blind, he did. And he went ahead and did that whole deception, led them all the way to Samaria, which is really interesting. And then God, took away their blindness when Elisha asked. So that's the second instance. And I'll just read the last one before we talk about it some more. The last one is really most interesting to me and probably the most direct. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 3. In the context of this, Saul had disobeyed God, and God has rejected Saul from being king. Now we pick up here in 1 Samuel 16, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you." So what God suggests that Samuel do is lie. Now, I know some people might say, well, it's not actually a lie, because Samuel did actually make a sacrifice with the heifer. Now, that's true, but that's not why he was there. And he goes down to where Jesse lives, and he says, the reason I'm here is because I'm just going to make a sacrifice. That's an obvious deception. He did it because if Saul knew what Samuel was doing, trying to anoint a new king, Saul would kill him. That was the fear. So God says, okay, tell him you're there for a sacrifice. And while you're doing the sacrifice, invite Jesse to it. So, I mean, it's pretty clear to me. It's really, at least it's very hard. It would be very hard for me, honestly speaking, to try to interpret these situations as anything other than, stretching the truth or completely denying it and causing, causing a deception to occur. Now, I think this is where we get into, again, Aristotle's idea of the virtue which lies between two vices. We talked about how on one side is guile or deceit or lying. You're basically, the guileful person or the deceitful person doesn't respect their responsibilities to the truth. But here you have presented a possibility of another extreme, which I would say is the best described by flippancy. You're kind of, giving out information and telling the truth to people in cases that would cause there to be a negative consequence. And so what flippant people do is that they don't respect their other responsibilities. And this is really what we're talking about here, isn't it? In this specific situation of the serial killer who comes in and he demands that you tell him the truth. Is there someone else in here? The two opposing responsibilities that you have are, one, you have the responsibility to the truth, but the other one is you have a responsibility to your family. Now, this is where the dilemma comes in, because it seems to me that we need to figure out a hierarchy of values that, well, first of all, there is, I think, a necessary hierarchy of values that we implicitly hold, because if we didn't hold one thing as being more important than another, then we would never actually do anything. But we do. We say things over other things. We do certain actions over others. We have a hierarchical system of values, but I think a lot of times they're not consciously created as such. So we need to think about, okay, what is more important? Now, I've heard this particular situation of the serial killer mentioned many times, and the thing is, the question is which do you value more? Your responsibilities to protect your family or your responsibility to the truth? Some people say, well, you've got to tell the truth, and the whole truth, and nothing but it in essence. Well, perhaps you can withhold from telling the truth, but at least you cannot give any sort of cause any sort of deception in any case whatsoever. So what you're saying is, in that case, your responsibility to the truth is more important than your responsibility to the family. Now, all I'm going to ask is, why that? Why isn't it the other way around? Because I think the scriptures and our own reasoning can set down pretty well that we also have a responsibility to protect our families. And I'll just lay that out really quickly. So what divine attribute would we get that particular action from? The protecting your family. Well, of course, it would come from the divine attribute of fatherly love. 1 John 4:8 says that God is love, and John 15:9 says that Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you, and I want you to abide in my love. So love is this attribute of God which is manifested in Jesus Christ, and it's applied to us. Just like Isaiah says in Isaiah 8:18, he's basically quoting Jesus. He's talking about, I am the children whom the Lord is giving to me. So there's this kind of familial connection that's there. And Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, God says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So God's represented in the scriptures as a loving father who protects his children. Or like that's really mentioned a lot in the New Testament, Matthew 6:9, right? Our Father who art in heaven. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting how we come to this understanding of God. And Psalm 103 verse 13 really lays it out very well. He says, as a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. Now that affection and compassion is a natural thing. And as a matter of fact, in Romans chapter 1 and verse 31, when Paul's talking about the Gentiles, and he's talking about the sins that the Gentiles have committed, one of the ones he mentions in verse 31 is the lack of natural affection. King James says that, without natural affection. Some modern translations will say heartless. And that's essentially the idea is, Laura has a natural affection for her children. It's even biologically based. Some people, because of their experiences, can actually somehow become so, morphed and demented to get away from that natural affection to where you'd even abuse or even kill maybe one of your own children. And that's obviously, another part of that dichromatic nature. That would be falling under the realm of Satan there. That's what he would do. But God, we understand as being the loving Father. Now, we understand this principle in two different ways. We understand it, first of all, I think, psychologically. Like how we perceive it is that it's sort of an anthropomorphism, right? When we talk about God being like a father. Because I see fathers in my experience. I have a father, and I see fathers in this room, and I've seen good examples of that, right? I've seen when the family worked out well because the father was protective of and loving of and compassionate towards his children. So I can take those specific actions that I've seen over, say, multiple substrates and different experiences, and I can extrapolate and abstract that into, okay, well, this is what a father is. This is the principle from which springs all of those actions. And so that principle is the characteristic of God. That's kind of how I arrived to that. In that sense, it's sort of an anthropomorphism. It's kind of making, in our minds, God like us. But I think I kind of thought about a new term, which maybe should be introduced to the theological discussion, which is that philosophically, like as this exists in essence, apart from our perceptions, what this really is a theomorphism. It's really us being like God. Because the fact is, love and compassion and that sort of fatherly love it exists in God and it existed in God before and apart from us. So it really is simply the way God is. It's an attribute of God. And as such, it has disseminated into the structuring of the world and the structuring of our relationships. So you can kind of perceive it in those different ways. Either way, we get the divine characteristic that God's a loving father. And so we understand the universal principle that we would draw from that, which is that a father ought to protect his children in this particular case, right? Now, the question is, does that apply in every situation? So what about when one of your children attacks the other one? Okay, well, say 2 Samuel 13:14, when David's son raped his own sister. Now, if you're in this type of situation where you have an assault happening, let's say between two of your children, say you've got a son that's trying to attack one of your younger sons and kill him or something like, which does happen. This isn't hypothetical in this case. This stuff actually happens. Okay, so as a father, say, if he had to, is he required to, say, I guess, take down his son, even if that involves harming him in some way? Now, I mean, obviously, this is kind of messes things up a little bit for us, right? It gives us perhaps a little bit more of a dilemma. The thing is, we have different responsibilities, and sometimes they seem to conflict in certain ways. So another instance might be, what about when you're on opposite sides of a war? Now, this is not hypothetical either. In the Civil War, fathers and sons fought on, say, the South and the North, respectively, in many different cases. Brothers fought against each other, fathers and sons. Different relatives did. You had that dilemma, which actually existed in real life. So this isn't just, these types of situations aren't just hypothetical. These things actually happen, and you will face some of these things. And the fact is, there are inherent contradictions in life. That's what it seems to me. Now, this is true on multiple levels. It's true, of course, in human-made ethical standards. And I thought of a couple examples of that. It's really interesting. There's actually, this first one, I don't know if it's actually true. It's just a story I heard. That it could be true, it could not be. But either way, it's a good story. So the idea was, at least in this particular case, there was a train, and the law was that if there's anything wrong with the train whatsoever, you're actually not allowed to move it on the tracks. If there's some malfunction, it's got to stay put. Now, this particular train was over a bridge, and it had some issues. They had to stop the train. Part of it was over a bridge, and they were trying to fix the problems. Now, somehow or other, the bridge happened to catch on fire while they were sitting there. So they called the control center and say, okay, well, this bridge we're sitting on is on fire. Can I move the train? And they said, no, if there's a malfunction of the train, you are not legally allowed to move it off the bridge. So they had to leave it there, and the train burned because the bridge caught the train on fire. Okay, good.
Well, I think Into Thin Air, the movie about climbing, I don't think it's Everest, but it's a mountain. It was the first time it ever been climbed.
Mhm.
And the rule is, I'm not a mountain climber, but I know this rule. You're never allowed to cut the rope. Unless you know the person's dead.
Okay.
You're never allowed to cut
Right.
the rope.
Right.
Well, the whole entire book, and there was a movie based on it, is about a guy who cut the rope and the guy was still alive. And he somehow managed to get out.
Huh.
So it's the same sort of idea of there's this situation where there's a rule, and in this case, they broke it. In your case, they actually held to it.
Right, and bad consequences.
Bad consequences either way.
Right.
think
It's
that's
a real
part of-
dilemma.
yeah.
Okay, and there's another example, which I know this story is where we talked about this. You know, Dr. Ben Carson actually had an episode when he was a resident at Johns Hopkins, which was that all of the surgeons were away at some conference, the brain surgeons. And this guy comes in and had a brain injury. He had a baseball player, had pieces of a bat in his head. You know, he needed an operation right now. And it was illegal for a resident, of course, to perform an operation without any attending physicians, anyone else there. And he did it anyway because the guy was going to die. Now, it was good in that case. He saved the guy's life and obviously wasn't, fired at the beginning of his career because we know who he is even to this day, one of the most famous neurosurgeons and neuroscientists ever. But so anyway, that's another example. You know, human ethical systems have those problems. Now, I think we should make a distinction between human ethical systems and morality as it relates to, God and what's actually right or wrong. And Quentin showed me this when we were talking about it earlier this week. You know, it's unethical, he says, right, for Quentin, say, to date someone in his, that's a patient of his. Now, it wouldn't be, well, I guess it would be immoral in his case because he's married, but let's say that he wasn't. It's not actually, unless it's her, I guess. It's not actually immoral to date someone that you're, that's your patient, right? Provided all the other things are in place. It's just unethical, right? So there's a pretty good distinction there. I guess speed limits would be another example, right? It's not actually inherently a sin for a human being to travel over a certain, speed limit, but it's unethical to do so because of the laws that we've set up. And insofar as we fall under the jurisdiction of those laws, it becomes immoral to break that ethical system. But there is a distinction between them. Another example is when I was in school at the Memphis School of Preaching, you actually were not allowed to wear shorts. Now, obviously, it's not a sin to wear shorts, generally speaking. Anyway, I guess it was unethical in that particular case. You had to sign this thing. And there was a problem at Memphis because you had to sign this thing saying you're going to obey all these rules, and they were just almost impossible to obey. Most of us broke them either on purpose or on accident, except for one guy who was so ingenious. Wasn't the smartest student in the world. I think he just got by on C's, but I still say he's genius because he just didn't sign the thing. So he didn't have to do anything. Yeah, he did. He just didn't sign. Yeah, there's so many students at turning it in at one time, you don't really notice, I guess. At least he got away with it. So anyway, there's a distinction between those types of systems. But I was always told that even if there was a contradiction in those ethical systems on a human level, that will never happen on the true moral level. I don't think that's true. At least it's not evident to me. It's not obvious to me that it is. I think that we still face some of these dilemmas. And I think the situations we talked about kind of bring that to the fore as well. Obviously you can make a decision towards one side or the other, but when it comes down to it, it seems as if no option is necessarily perfect. So what we need to do is consciously, purposefully construct a hierarchy of values. But I think there's a couple of problems with being able to do that. The first one, the most obvious one is, well, what's the standard by which we would place one value over another? Go ahead.
I was going to say, 1 Timothy 5, verse, turn open, that has to do with our particular discussion. I've got it open on my Bible sitting there.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to be able to figure that out.
It's right here.
The Bible right here. Oh, that's Bible. I thought you meant in the computer.
No, the real thing.
See, the real thing. Okay, now what is it?
It's 5 and verse 8.
It says, But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever.
And provide there is not just giving them food and those sort of things.
Right, that'd be providing for their
Also
well-being in every sense. Right, protection. Right, yeah, okay, so you've got, two, and right, if you don't do that, you're worse than an infidel. Right, that's pretty strong language.
Right, it's
So-
saying that's worse, breaking that truth is worse than not believing at all.
Right. Okay, so yeah, I mean, there are some dilemmas here, and deciding which one goes over another. I mean, what's the standard for doing that? Now, I have this idea. I would call it this sort of source of origin theory. I don't know if theory is the right word for it. I guess technically it is. But we talked about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and Plato said that those things are forms. The idea of a form is basically the highest version of anything that you could possibly conceive of, right? So insofar as I say things which are true, or for instance, let's say I'll say that insofar as you say something that's true, you're kind of accessing that truest form of the truth, right? When you do something which is good, you're accessing the form of the good, right? The highest standard, I guess, for those things. You've got the true, the good, and the beautiful. So from those forms come the virtues, and from those virtues come specific actions which follow them. So for instance, if I were to say, make sure I don't plagiarize when I'm writing a paper, and I make sure I check my sources, and I'm quoting people and saying what they actually said. Those are specific actions which fall under the virtue, you might say, of intellectual integrity. And intellectual integrity follows under and goes towards the form of truth, right? That's the reason for why I'm doing that. That's the hierarchy, right? Now, let's say I give food to a poor person who needs food, right? That's a specific action which is following under the virtue of charity, which falls under the form of the good, right? So we kind of see where things come from. Certain actions spring from virtues, and they spring from the forms. Now, some actions and virtues aren't necessarily moral. They don't have the same, sense of oughtness to them. So that really falls under the idea of beauty. I mean, let's say you create a beautiful painting, and that exhibits a virtue, you might say creativity, which comes from the form of beauty, but it's not really something you need to do, right? I mean, that won't save your soul making a painting. So not all of these actions fall under categories of oughtness. And so that's the issue here, really, is that as we can see, it's not so much that the different forms are say more important than each of them. They're just different. And the fact is, we can't really see, okay, well, what unites all of them? We know the good, the true, and the beautiful, the way, the truth, and the life, but what in essence unites them all and makes them one? And the fact is, we really don't know. At least not without God, we don't know. And so really, this is the second problem, is there's an issue of understanding the fundamental laws to the universe. Now, Quentin perhaps can tell me, this is a good illustration for this lack of understanding we have of the fundamental laws of morality. What are the four fundamental forces or interactions in physics?
So it's, you said the four laws of
No, the four fundamental forces in physics or interactions, right? Okay, no,
Are you talking intramolecular? Are you talking like
Well, all
the
of them.
theory of relativity?
Okay, now look.
Theory of relativity?
Well,
what are you going right?
Okay.
You got gravitation.
You said you studied
You
physics.
got gravitation.
Right, gravitation.
Gravitation. Then
Right.
you have the action that occurs within the bonds of a molecule.
Okay, right, okay, so you've got, okay, so on a say cosmic level, you've got two that interact with each other, gravitation and electromagnetism, right?
Right.
So you've got the electromagnetism, which is it's basically a force carried by the photon, which creates magnetic and electric fields. And you've got gravitation, which is, I guess briefly, the curvature of space.
Unified theory of relativity.
Okay. Anyway, those are some fundamental laws. You can see them on a large scale, right? You can see them in the movement of planetary bodies, or when I drop a pin, or in lightning, or in a compass that goes north, that type of thing. You can see those forces act in the cosmos. Now, there's the strong and weak interactions, which is what, governs kind of, you might say, on the nuclear atomic level. And those things, basically speaking, one forms things together, and the other one kind of separates them or moderates the rate of radioactive decay, essentially. Now, the idea in physics is these are the fundamental four interactions and forces that we can't perceive of anything underneath them. Now, there's the idea that there might be one force which unifies them, a law, you might say, which unifies them, which lies underneath them. You would need, say, like a particle accelerator that would be able to to accelerate the particle fast enough to where there's an energy enough to where you could perceive it on a small scale called the Planck scale, right? But it's all speculative because we don't have a particle accelerator that's powerful enough to do that. So, right, yeah, sure. So anyway, the idea is that even on a scientific level, you see things that are laws. Like for instance, the law of gravity. If I drop something, it'll fall. But what I'm saying is that may not actually be the law. And that's an interesting way to understand, say, miracles. And now when Jesus, C.S. Lewis also wrote a really important book on miracles, and he kind of goes into that. I think he makes a pretty good case for how it's not so much that when a miracle occurs, the laws of the universe are suspended or broken. I think there's a deeper law that we just don't perceive, which God is still following. It really, I think on a philosophical level, is not very tenable that God would break his own laws. Now, that's just my opinion. But I think we can apply that to the moral perspective and see that we really don't know what good is. We've never actually seen it, not in its purest form. So we don't really know how to inform our own actions. We don't know what unites the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I think that's really the important point here. Now, I'm going to skip over a few things as we're pretty much out of time. But that's the fact is we don't really, well, Blaise Pascal actually mentioned that in his book, Pensées, or Meditations. He was a French Catholic philosopher, and he said basically mankind is stuck in the middle of existence. He can't really perceive the ends of the universe and the cosmos, and he can't really perceive the beginnings of them in the microcosmos. Whereas Ecclesiastes 3:11 says God has put eternity into man's heart, but so that he can't find out what went on before or what will go on afterward. He can't see the beginning or the end. So the point is, what underlies our moral laws is a higher law which we don't understand. Now, this is where I think a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer can come in and help us. Now, I borrowed this book. I just kind of wanted to see something he said about some particular subject. So I borrowed it from Quentin this week, but I started reading it, and man, it's a killer book. I think it's called Ethics. It's what it's about by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Don't ask me to spell that right now. And go look at the book later. He was a German theologian that wrote this book on ethics. It's unfinished, but it's just incredible. I think it'll take me 10 years to unpack the ideas in that book.
It's unfinished because of Nazis.
Right, he's dead. But he laid out a really interesting case for this. Now, I'm just going to kind of disseminate what he said, and I think it really informs this dilemma and helps us to understand it. I kind of put it down in 6 points. The first one is we exist in a world of conflicts, and we established that pretty well. We have these conflicts that come up in our moral decision making. He said this source of conflict begins in Eden, when mankind obtains the knowledge of good and evil apart from God. And that's essentially what eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was. It's not that Eve didn't know what was good and right and wrong. She knew it through God. But what she did in taking the fruit was she knew it apart from God then. And so that's really the issue here, is that we exist in a world of conflicts which begins there, when we know right and wrong or good and evil apart from God. Second, that conflict ends when we give up that experiential and propositional knowledge of good and evil and replace it with a relationship with God. We should know good and evil only through God. And so third, in this sense, actually, Christianity, in a sense, destroys ethics, which is the knowledge of good and evil, and replaces it with one important thing, the will of God. So for us, we don't perceive the good, the true, and the beautiful and what unites them. What we do perceive is what God tells us to do. What we perceive is his will in the world. Now, fourth, what is the will of God? The will of God is love. And it's presented to us not so much in a philosophical discourse. It's presented to us in the person of Jesus Christ. And it lives on in our relationships as the church, our relationships with other divinely ordained institutions. You've got the government, right? The powers that be, the state, you might say. You have the church, you have the family, and you have the culture at large. So really the idea, sixth, in ethics is that we'll fit, insofar as we fulfill our responsibilities within those relationships, that's how we're living a moral life and obeying the will of God. Now, last, that means that ethics is really a matter of practice. It's not reducible to theoretical formulations, because the will of God was presented to us in a historical form, presented to us as a person, Jesus, who lived and acted in the world and now lives in us, in mankind in general, right? But it's manifested in the church. That's sort of the nucleus of moral action in the world, because it's the nucleus of Christ's presence, which is coming right before the consummation of the salvation of mankind. So this is where we are. The fact is, we don't foresee all the ends of our actions. We don't really know exactly what good is by ourselves. What we're supposed to do is really trust the will of God. And so insofar as we do that, I think I think that's really the answer there. And so he really lays out something else too important, specific to our discussion on truth. Now, we'll end with this. The thing about telling the truth is when you say tell the truth, you might mean something different in certain contexts, right? So the question is, okay, well, how do I go about telling the truth? Now, this is what he says. When a child, say, is asked by his parents, tell the truth, he means something that the parent asking the child that means something different than if the child told the parent to tell the truth. What the child is owed by the parent is something very different than what the parent is owed by the child. And same in our discussions on being a witness or being a teacher or all that sort of thing, as obviously being God too. I mean, God has withheld information from us for thousands of years until the fullness of time that he revealed his son. So, I mean, that's the thing is you have to take into account a few things, 4 basic things. One is who you're talking to, who's asking the question of you, who's demanding that you speak. 2, what you're talking about. But really, more importantly, I guess, who you're talking to, the situation in which you are, right? The environment. Okay, when it would be very good or profitable for me to talk about, say, my salary with the elders while I'm in like the worship service publicly, right? That's not a good idea. So, environment changes what you're able and what you should be able to say. Same with like children. Parents really shouldn't talk about the marital problems if the children are nearby, right? So, the situation is important, the environment. Then, of course, it's what entitles you to speak in the first place. What gives you the right to say what you're going to say? And then relate all that to what you're talking about. So I think that's really important in this case. If you think about it in terms of relationships with the government, with the culture, with each other, if you owe some truth to the governing authorities, like Josh was saying in the last period. But a serial killer rapist comes in, and what do you owe him? Right? He's not really operating from within the culture. He's actually operating against it in our case. He's not operating from within the church. He's not operating from within the government or within the family, for that matter. He's operating against all of those things. And so I think that's really the thing is you've got to ask those questions on would it actually be, in the larger sense, telling the truth to tell him that you've got those daughters upstairs. And in any other sort of situation, what about if somebody, say in war? Well, I guess Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a good example of this. Now, he was part of the German resistance. He was a part of a lot of efforts to actually take the life of Adolf Hitler, and he had to lie to German authorities about who he was, and sometimes they'd question him, and sometimes he had to misdirect them with lies. Now, he struggled with this problem himself, which was, is that actually right? And he came to the conclusion that it was. Because you have to think about what is telling the truth, and is it always saying exactly what's true in that, or what's true in that particular case? That's really the rationale for a lot of people who gossip, right? People that are talking about someone behind their back, and a lot of times the defense for it is, oh, well, it's true. Like, well, that doesn't entitle you to say it. And it doesn't entitle you to say it to me. And it doesn't entitle you to say it to me about that person, especially in this particular context. So I think, you've got to take all these things into account. And I'll ramble on and on for a long time. But, this essentially is the way we've kind of worked through this. But I think I want to end with this, really, before I ask for any more last questions or comments, which is, I think we need to realize that we really don't foresee the ends of our actions. And the fact is, what makes something wrong is, first of all, evil intentions, right? That always makes something wrong. Even if there aren't negative consequences, an action with an evil intention in it is still evil. Now, of course, the negative consequences will make it evil as well. And so that's important to note. But the fact is, sometimes we don't see the ends of our actions. We don't really know if ultimately our actions will have negative or positive consequences. So Plato said that really no one can do right because, or at least not in every case, because we don't know everything. He says if you did know and you did believe the truth, you actually wouldn't do wrong. And I think to some degree he's right. Now, I think that's at least the case, that we don't know everything. That's obvious. And since that's the case, we have sort of an incompetence, which keeps us from always knowing whether or not we're doing right. And that is exactly why the psalmist said in Psalm 19, Psalm 19, he says, who can discern his own errors? And so he asks God to cleanse me from my secret faults, the faults that even he didn't know about. So I think that's the thing is when we approach these things, you have to take the situations as they come. And that's not situational ethics. Situational ethics is saying there are no absolutes, and that's obviously not true. Jesus is the absolute. Now, how we apply the Spirit of Christ in our relationships, that is the thing that will change depending on the situation. But really what we need to do is have faith that God will, in a sense, cause us to stand even when we do make those mistakes. We try the best we can. We ask forgiveness when we fail. And we try to, I guess, as Paul said, take heed lest you fall. But I want to end just with this last verse on just kind of acting in faith. Romans 14, 1 through 4, the context is, I guess, being weak in faith and thinking that some things are wrong, like eating meat sacrificed to idols. Paul says, as for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him. Do not quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and this is the important point. He will be upheld, because the Lord is able to make him stand. The fact is, judgment lies on us for our incompetence and our immorality. That's obvious. But the gospel is that the mercy triumphs over judgment. So we need to do all of our actions, with the best knowledge that we have, looking at the biggest picture that we can, to apply Christ and his truth as in our relationships, and just do it with faith. And basically, at the end of it all, try to do the best you can. So anyway, are there comments or questions that we need to go into as we close? Or did I pretty much put you all to sleep? Okay, well, next week I want to talk about more specifically virtue. Now, we've talked about virtue as a concept, but specific virtues and what virtue is, and more things, and especially in the context of, we talked about general things tonight, but in the context of a specific situation and specific issues and dilemmas. Now, I want to talk about virtue in the context of sexual morality. Now, I mentioned Jordan Peterson a lot, I know, but he's great. And he said once that really, as a culture, the West is not mature enough to have a conversation and talk about and formulate a sexual ethic. And that might be true on a cultural level. But I think that as the church, we have a responsibility to see what we can do to offer a real, coherent, comprehensive sexual ethic, a reason why we say certain things are wrong and certain things are permissible. Because I think that's one thing that we really lacked in our ethical teachings in the church is, why are certain things wrong? And establishing that maybe on a universally accessible level, I think is a really important thing to do. So that's what we're going to tackle next week. Sounds, easy enough, right? Just as easy as this one was. Anyway, are there any last comments or questions before we close? Then